ladies and gentlemen, I'm rusty with my English because I haven't used it for a while. But my guest today, this evening, is a guest I've been following for a while now. A couple of my friends are really fanboys of you. Jay Dyer, writer, researcher, a philosopher, and an Orthodox Christian. Thanks for joining me, Jay.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm honored that you wanted to reach out.
Yeah, of course. There are a couple of Slovene philosophy and Christianity enthusiasts that are really fanboys of you, including
That's probably
me.
the only two there. Right?
Okay, I admit it. We're some sort of autists. It's true. I'm joking.
No, I just meant that I didn't have. It's a small reach. That's all I meant. I wasn't making fun of you.
Yeah, but you can make it. It is for the time being. I do have a small reach. Maybe this will get better.
No. I meant my reach. Never mind.
Oh, your reach.
I was
to my audience. You're okay.
I was saying there's only two people who liked my stuff in all of Slovenia. That's all I meant.
In all of Slovenia. No, it's actually 10.
Okay, 10. Better than 2. Go ahead.
Jay, first question. In Slovenia, we have some Orthodox people, Orthodox Christian people, but they're always Serbs or Montenegrins or Macedonians or Russians. You're an American. You have an Anglo-Saxon name. What's the story behind your orthodoxy? How come that you're an American that is Orthodox Christian?
Well, I was raised Baptist, and then in my early 20s, I started getting into the church fathers. And so you can see here the church fathers. I started diving into them when I was about 21 or 22. I read a lot of them at length. And at that time, back in about 99, 2000, there wasn't a whole lot of internet resources on this stuff. It was basically just Protestant versus Catholic debates. So I didn't know much about Orthodoxy at the time, but I just knew about Catholicism, and I dove into that debate for a while and eventually got into Roman Catholicism. I got serious about that through most of my 20s, went to the Latin Mass for many, many years. But I always felt like there was something off here with Vatican II and the reformations after Vatican II in the church. So that's kind of what inadvertently launched me into looking into Orthodoxy. And there are quite a few Orthodox churches throughout the U.S. There's a couple that were a few hours from me, maybe 2 hours. So started visiting those, checking them out. And it took a long, long time. But basically, I just read throughout my 30s and then eventually became Orthodox. So for me, it was just a kind of a fulfillment of looking at the three main branches of, quote, Christianity and seeing which one matched up to not just the Bible, but also the first millennium of Christianity. So for me, after many years in Roman Catholicism, it looked like Orthodoxy was a much better contender for who is the authentic inheritor of the first millennium of Christianity.
Is it mostly because you think because of the Vatican II and and the modernism in the church subverting the church, or are there any other reasons?
That's just one catalyst that led me to looking deeper into the issues. I mean, modernism is involved in any modern religious tradition. I mean, Orthodoxy is not unique. I mean, maybe they have a little bit less modernism, but it's still there. It's still a problem anywhere. I just meant that the issue with the notion of infallibility of the church and the seeming contradictions between pre-Vatican II teaching and post-Vatican II teaching led me to questioning things at a different level, looking into the history of the papacy, the claims of the papacy, in a way and to a degree that I'd never researched before when I was a Protestant looking into Catholicism. So I just took it a lot deeper. And for me, ultimately, the issues ended up being about two conceptions of the Trinity, two conceptions of God, following either the Latin tradition with Augustine into the Middle Ages with Anselm and Aquinas, or with a more Cappadocian emphasis that led to the Eastern Councils and Maximus and Gregory Palamas. So I think there's two ideological branches that go in those two different directions. Issues like the filioque are results of this divergence. They're not the actual cause of the split. They're just the manifestation of the final point of where the two churches go in different ways.
We'll end our conversation with with easier questions, with more fun questions. But let's begin with harder ones. I listened to your podcast with Kantbotu, with one of my favorite materialists or satirical characters in Twitter and in internetosphere. And it's where you told him that you don't like, or that you deny, dialectical paradigm. What is dialectical paradigm for you, and why are you against it?
Right. So this relates to the last thing that we were talking about, that in Orthodox theology, the Trinity is a doctrine that grounds all of reality in our world, but it also transcends the created antinomies, as they're called. So you have contrast, contradictions, day and night, black and white, what are sometimes called dialectics. May not always be a dialectic, but in logic and philosophy, either ors, right? In Orthodox theology, the Trinity encompasses those, but also transcends it. This is very basic to the Cappadocians. It's very basic to St. Maximus. Very basic to St. Gregory Palamas. Vladimir Lavsky has many sections where he talks about the Trinity transcending the dyad. So in our theology, we don't have that problem of either ors. And in the tradition of the West, you get pretty strict either or dichotomies. And in my view, that led to the rise of Marxism out of Hegelianism. So all forms of dialecticism, I don't mean dialectics in terms of pedagogy, I mean dialectics in terms of metaphysics. All of that we would reject because we have a different metaphysic, particularly St. Maximus the Confessor, who has the most grandiose explication of our metaphysic.
Did you persuade Kantbotu, or did he stay dialectical materialist?
I don't know what his present position is. I mean, I don't know him that well. I like his material, what I've seen of it, and we had talked about doing another interview, but I don't know where he stands.
A very large proportion of the population seems to be cursed with inability to think using abstract categories, because such operation consists of sophisticated symbolic manipulations via principles of formal logic, etc., and are therefore complicated and cognitively demanding. Is it therefore reasonable to assume that no matter what happens, majority of mankind will always be doomed to experience the world through a primitive sensory lens through which they can process only dialectical oppositions such as pleasure, pain, etc.?
Unfortunately, yes, that will probably always be the case. However, I don't think that the mass man, the majority man, is who moves or propels culture. I think that there are culture bearers. These people are amongst the elite, so to speak. I speak here of a true elite, not just a moneyed elite or a will to power elite, but a real class of intellectuals, theologians, people who do propel and lead, say, the church, or lead things, and even in the literature, the arts, there are culture bearers in the arts as well. So it's really the task of those people that have that gift to do that, not the task of the everyman. But that doesn't mean we have to, cast away the everyman. It's just that he has his place. But I don't think that will ever change, no.
If you analyze historical events and the present, you find that the last few centuries, the West has witnessed markedly fierce battles for supremacy over narrative. The narrative itself is a derivative of discourse, which is a derivative of ideology, and ideology is de facto skewed worldview because it undermines some aspects of reality and over-exaggerates a small number of other aspects of reality. It seems that when you look at narrative creators and narrative dispatchers, such as media, launching the narrative into public discourse, it is simply not possible to uncover all layers of errors and logical errors and distribute them among society as fast as the narrative itself penetrates public discourse and integrates itself into human mind. Are we therefore in a never-ending narrative loop of half-truths and rhetorically sophisticated packages with self-refuting axiomatic cores, or can we do anything to break this cycle?
Some of the pioneers of social media have spoken about the fact that social media was intended to destabilize, in the sense of the never-ending scroll gives you an impression of a sort of instability and never coming to know something factual, because it's just a never-ending feed. And so this infinite data feed is really something that causes us to feel relativistic. We feel like because there's always an infinite span of information to come, we can never exhaust the information on any topic. This, as some of the social media planners and executives themselves said, had a negative detrimental effect on society as a whole. I believe that was designed. It was done on purpose to do what you're talking about, to destroy the possibility of people believing in objective truth, not just coming to objective truth, but destroying the possibility of coming to objective truth. So now that that possibility has been destroyed, what happens is the power players, people who run, as you said, the big media companies or the big tech companies now, or who are kind of integrating with the media and controlling the narrative as a whole, they're able to just foist it as a power play. So it's turned into this weird, we're past the idea of truth. We're past the idea of it's beyond even postmodernism into like a pure simulacra, where it doesn't even matter. Nobody's even concerned with those questions. I mean, now it's just like a pure download into the mass brain. And I think that's what they always were hoping to achieve, a sort of golem, creating a sort of mindless golem that they could just download the new updates into. And then you would have this creature that you could, move around like a big mass mind goblin, so to speak, right? Like the golem of medieval alchemy and mysticism.
In the debate with Mattom Dillahuntyjem, I watched on the evidence for the existence of God, you criticized Matt, and rightfully so, in my opinion, that he's ultimately just being ad hoc, because his arguments against God stem from him blindly and unjustifiably accepting the premise that the laws of logic work, stating that it is obvious that they work. You yourself said that in order for us not being ad hoc, we necessarily need the best possible explanation. You see it in a perfect being, that is God, which is the answer to why things are the way they are, because God ultimately is the one who designed these things and created the world by his own image. My question, though, is, but let us play a devil's advocate here for just a second. The argument for God itself consists of categories of mind, such as best possible explanation, logic, universe, cause, etc. Is not necessary to presume the legitimacy of such categories before you are allowed to construct such a complex category such as God, and if so, how can you presume that these categories of mind are legitimate? Just playing a devil's advocate.
Yeah, this gets into the argument that I was making, which is a transcendental argument, which is to say that rather than a direct proof, it's more of an indirect proof, because what we're arguing is that there are many things that are preconditions for knowledge itself. So rather than launching into arguments based on causality, arguments based on teleology, arguments based on morals, arguments based on whatever, we're stepping back a step, and we're saying, hey, let's look at what are the preconditions for arguing at all. What are the preconditions for doing logic at all? What are the preconditions for making sentences, for meaning, right? For any of these things, spatio-temporal relations, we could go into all kinds of different things that we call preconditions or transcendental categories. So when we have that perspective, when we look at all those types of things, we see that they actually come prior epistemically to argumentation itself. And if that's the case, then a better formulation of the argument for God's existence, I believe, is the transcendental argument. We look at that and we say, well, what kind of a worldview actually gives a coherent basis for how all of those transcendental preconditions hang or fall together, right? Because they don't operate independently of the others. Spatio-temporal relations as a presupposition don't operate independent of a mind, a self, who is perceiving them. I'm not talking about Buddhism. I'm just saying that when we make these kinds of arguments, if we're making arguments about things happening or existing in the world, that assumes that we're perceiving that to be the case. So the self is one of these transcendental categories that's undergoing. And anytime you're arguing, you're assuming a self in your argumentation, that you are a self that's arguing, unless you want to have some absurd thing that say, well, then there's no self that's arguing. If you're not arguing, then then you've lost the debate from the outset. Anyway, so my point there is just to say that is answering your question, because we're saying you have a paradigm of an atheist who has a certain set of presuppositions about all these categories. I have a paradigm as a theist that has a presupposition about all these categories. And so what we're looking at actually is not a debate over facts, quote unquote, but a debate over two different paradigms. Mine is consistent. The other one is inconsistent. And that gets into the history of philosophy and critiquing what will be called classical foundationalism, which is an older kind of ancient and Enlightenment view, that a medieval and Enlightenment view that you can have like neutrality, that things are brute facts. The modern world eventually moves past that. People don't believe that there are brute facts anymore, because we understand that facts and objects come to us as part of an interpretive matrix or paradigm, right? They're part of a web of beliefs. So you don't understand any object in the world, anything, without the rest of the things in your lexicon of vocabulary, of knowledge, of whatever. So if that's the case, then we can't have the older model of, like, say, Thomism, where you just look at an object and you derive from it these basic facts, and then you argue between you and somebody else who has completely different presuppositions what those facts are, because they're always going to be interpreting those facts according to the rose-colored glasses that they have. So what we need to do in apologetics is to question their paradigms, and that's what I did with Matt. Just summing up here, there were three things that I recall from Matt that were problematic. The first one was that he himself had said, don't believe in anything unless you have empirical evidence to prove it. But of course, there's no empirical evidence to prove the things that he said just work and he believes in, like the laws of logic. So that was a problem. When asked and pressed for a justification, he just said that they are. But saying something is not a justification. That's ad hoc. I could just say, okay, well, God is. He would not accept that, of course. And so likewise, we should not accept his contradictory claim about the laws of logic just are, but at the same time, we shouldn't believe in something without empirical evidence. So, and then the third thing was the crackers in the pantry fallacy, as it's sometimes called, which is Matt was demanding evidence for something that so I believe in something immaterial, God, and Matt was demanding essentially empirical material evidence for something immaterial. So that's called the crackers in the pantry fallacy, which ignores that different types of things are proven in different ways. So, for example, we don't go about proving the laws of logic by just saying, where is the empirical evidence for the laws of logic? Because they're a different type of thing from empirical physical sense data. So when the atheist does that, he kind of tries to poison the well or limit the possibilities of the things that can exist from the outset, which is an invalid move given the nature of what we're arguing over.
If you analyze your debate and his, how did he respond? Do you think that he understood your transcendental arguments, or no?
No, he didn't, and that was evident when he said that I thought there was no proofs for something that's a presupposition. And I was like, no, that's the whole reason that I'm here to argue. There are proofs. the proof is namely the fact that without this or that transcendental presupposition or category, you couldn't reason at all. That's the strongest possible proof. And so he didn't understand that. And that's why they did a subsequent follow-up analysis, him and two other PhDs who had to help him out.
He seemed like quite a rational guy before he debated you about the existence of God. I wanted to ask you this. If I remember my philosophy classes, it's been a while now. Transcendental arguments are Kantian, aren't they? Or are your transcendental arguments modification of how Kant fought Hume's skepticism about causality,
right.
basically?
So transcendental arguments have a life outside of Kant. Kant worked with transcendental arguments, but they certainly don't hinge upon or necessitate Kant. So I'm not a Kantian. Kant has some insights, but there's also some serious problems in Kant. And of course, we don't make the argument that Kant does. Kant doesn't make a transcendental argument for the existence of God in the way that we do. So you can go back to Aristotle in, I think, book 4 of the Metaphysics, where he presents essentially a version of a transcendental argument. You can look at early, even in Plato, there's intimations of transcendental type arguments. You can look at St. John of Damascus in the opening of his book, Fount of Knowledge. He makes a transcendental argument in the very first chapter. So they have a life outside of Kant. And then what Kant did, as you pointed out, was try to respond to Hume's skepticism, which there are a few places, again, where he's insightful. But of course, Kant buried all of this or locked all this off into the mind. So this just becomes, in Kant, a sort of a psychological schema or template for interpreting the world. But we're not saying that. We're actually saying that the actual world that we experience, the commonly experienced external world, is structured in a certain way such that all of these transcendental categories sort of hinge or fall together. That's the transcendental argument that I make.
Your relationship towards Thomism, you mentioned before that people nowadays don't believe in facti bruti. Is your transcendentalism the reaction to this fact that people, the majority of people, don't believe it anymore? Or are you yourself a disbeliever in facti bruti, and this is the reason why you're favorable? Both.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that, well, people don't believe in these things anymore, therefore they're not true. That would be absurd. I'm just saying that in the Middle Age, in the ancient medieval world, people didn't ask questions at a paradigm level, typically. After Descartes, after Vico, after some of these Enlightenment philosophers, Hume, people start asking very fundamental paradigmatic level questions that were not asked in the ancient and medieval world. So we need a philosophical response that responds to those objections. For example, think about Descartes' cogito, right? Descartes thought he was getting to what are the most basic questions, right? Well, what's the most basic thing that I could doubt, bury down to that at this point I can no longer doubt, right? And he says thinking is, therefore, he believes that it's that the cogito is a coherent. Later philosophers, of course, argue that it's not. But setting that aside for the moment, one thing that we can notice that he didn't investigate was language itself. Right? So he's utilizing linguistic philosophy, semiotics, sign and symbol, but it didn't occur to Descartes that to be able to say what he's saying, he's assuming language a meaning. Later, linguistic philosophers begin to question language itself, right? So the point is that you get in modern epistemology, I mean, this is, these are pretty common questions if you read like a text like Bonjour's text on epistemology or Sellers' text on empiricism. What you'll notice is that there's about 5 questions where people can't answer from an empiricist starting point, which is what all the classical foundationalists like Thomas and any Aristotelian has, is the myth of the given, the idea that we can know something from the effects and reason back to the cause, as if there's a similarity, when, according to Thomas Aquinas, the essence of God is nothing like creatures, right? But it's also like creatures. So there's this contradiction in being able to reason from creatures back to a first cause that's nothing like creatures. It doesn't make any sense. So if you look at, I think it's posterior analytics, Aristotle has a section where he talks about how there's a distinction between that which is known in itself versus that which is known by us. So that is an assumption that Aristotle has for his empirical approach that Aquinas merely adopts wholesale, and the modern philosophical questions begin to critique that. And I don't think they have a sufficient answer. That's why you can fast forward all the way up to William Van Orman Quine. And Quine asks all the same questions that Hume asks, and you can't respond to Quine or any of these people by just rehashing, well, we just know by sense experience. Because the question is, how do you know that you know only by sense experience? All right, these kinds of questions are asked. There's a bunch of them I could give you. I mean, there's 5 or 6, big issues that modern. There's a question about correspondence, like between the thought and the object in the world. There's questions of causal relations. How do you know that the causal relations, as you perceive them, apply to the objects of the world? I mean, there's the problem of the underdetermination of data. There's a problem of multiple problems like this that you can sort of go through one by one. And if you look at when I had the debate with Stefan Molyneux, I listed all these problems that empirical approaches to philosophy can't deal with. That's the point.
All these epistemological problems, do they force us into this epistemological turn that makes it impossible for the rational being or philosopher nowadays to be a Thomist or Aristotelian? Or would Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas today be transcendentalists, or would they stay foundationalists? What do you think? I'm forcing you into speculation.
Yeah, I don't know how they would answer that in the modern period. I mean, who knows? I think that it's a matter of, because I deal with a lot of Thomists, a lot of debates with Thomists. I have a lot of friends who are now Orthodox former Thomists who now look at things in a paradigm way. I just don't think most people at that time thought that way, but the problem, I think, is that it takes kind of a knowledge of modern philosophy and modern epistemology to begin to look in that direction. And a lot of Thomists don't do that. They focus on the medieval period, so they don't think about problems in modern philosophy as if they're relevant. But I think that if we want to answer the problems of modern philosophy, and we should, by the way, I mean, if we look at the debates, let me give you another example of where this comes into play. If you look at the way Aquinas considers natural theology, he says we can look out of the world and see that there's a creator, and we can reason back to some first cause, right, by some kind of higher spiritual substance or some perfect being or whatever. But the problem with that approach, as the Enlightenment atheists have been critiquing since the time of the Enlightenment, is that the natural world as it is has a lot of flaws in it. It has a predator-prey relationship in it. It has death as an operant principle in this world. So in order to properly interpret this world, the natural world as it is, you need revelation. You need the doctrine of the fall to understand that the fallen world out there is not what it was supposed to be. And if you try to interpret the natural world as it is, you would presume that the God who created that world out there is a psychopath, because he's instituted into the created order the predator-prey, death-life relationship. Death and life would be both natural. They would be just as necessary as one another. But that, of course, is not the Orthodox or the biblical position, because Paul says in Romans 8 that death is unnatural. Death entered the world as a result of the fall. It did not exist prior to the fall, and that's death across the board, whether it's physical, animal, vegetative, all death entered as a result of the fall, hence why Christ is able to remove in the eschaton all death, including animal, vegetative, physical, cosmic, etc. That's the cosmic scope that Orthodox Christianity stresses that the other Christianities no longer have. They lost the cosmic recapitulation that Christ brought, and all the Eastern Fathers teach that. So I thought that was a very powerful. Anyway, but the point is that in Thomism, you could never have that. The incarnation is not the principle of creation and the purpose of creation itself. It's something that occurs afterwards. This is why Thomas says that Christ didn't have to become incarnate. But in fact, in the Orthodox conception, man was created on the principle of the incarnation. Even if man had not fallen, Christ was intended to become incarnate. So that just proves natural theology is what I'm trying to say in the Thomistic conception. And Thomas's apologetic is bound up with his natural theology.
Which is natural, okay. When you debated Stefan Molyneux about ethics, you used your transcendentalism, if I can call it like that, also. How did this debate go, and what do you think about his ethic? I believe he's an atheist that respects Christianity culturally and so forth and so forth. Although he's been brought up as a Christian, I believe, and he later became an atheist and never stopped being it. And what do you think about his ethics and his political views? He's an anarcho-capitalist. How can you, or if you can combine this with Christianity? Because I have some Protestant friends that are libertarians, anarcho-capitalists, and so forth. Do you have views about this?
Yeah, I was just trying to find the section where I mentioned what I thought were the flaws in Stefan's approach. I think that Stefan wasn't aware of what a transcendental argument was. In his book, he calls them self-detonating arguments. He doesn't realize that that's just talking about what we talk about with transcendental arguments. So as we covered that in the debate, I think it was evident that there were a lot of things he wasn't aware of in terms of the terminology and in terms of the ideas. I'm not knocking him. I'm just saying that that's what I think the disparity in the debate was. I was looking for this section where we debated. Here it is. So the points that I made in my so there's the myth of the given, there's the problem of the external world, there's the problem of induction, the status of immaterial objects, and the assumption of properly basic beliefs. All of those, and there could be more, but those 5 problems for any modern approach or any basic empiricist approach, they apply to Stefan Molyneux as much as they apply to Thomas Aquinas, because everything since then has had just a basic empiricist approach to all these questions. And that's what we're calling into question. So I call into question the same points with Aquinas as I do with Stefan Molyneux, and I don't think that Stefan was aware of those. Those are 5 basic problems in epistemology, and I don't think he was even aware of any of those. So with Stefan, that was, I think, very, very crucial. He wasn't aware of abstract questions about numbers, logic, the status of those things themselves. He said, why don't we just call 7 coconuts 7? Because I'm asking a different question. I'm asking about the question of the status of 7 itself, which I guess he didn't want to think about or had not thought about. But beyond that, in terms of the ethical arena, he, I think, does see the problem, because most people can tell, if you want to make a really simple transcendental argument, it's easier to focus on the ethical side of it, because you're pointing out that, value judgments require some kind of standard. You can't locate the standard of value judgments in the physical. It's just because it's obviously absurd. There's no physical or a category of what collection of molecules are you going to look to determine what a good is, right? There's no, on pretty much every empiricist perspective, unless you're some weirdo like Berkeley or something, they don't believe in anything, quote, universal. There's no universals. They're all nominalistic positions. Well, how can you have a good, right? There's no universal good. There's no objective good in any of those positions. So that's been a problem for hundreds of years for those kinds of views. But most people who accept those views don't know that, or they're not that studied or sophisticated to look at that level of the problem. But I think, again, in the debate with Stefan, it started becoming clear that you can't just arbitrarily say universally preferable behavior as a nominalist. There's no such thing as any universal anything if you're a nominalist. It's just arbitrary. That's the point. So that was a problem, I think, for his position. And then that leads to the problem of the libertarian ethos, which is that the libertarian ethos is built on all the same Enlightenment rejections of metaphysics. So if you want to be a libertarian, then be consistent and give up all of your notions of universals and these categories of objective truth, and submit to the physicalism that you adhere to, because those positions don't go together. If you want to be a libertarian, you're going to have to realize that libertarianism is an atheistic, materialistic position about monetary policy and social order, the market, that already from the outset presupposes that metaphysics is not what religion or theology or theism says.
Did you ever notice even?
I mean, it's based on nominalism too. What I'm trying to say, I called it economic nominalism. I wrote an essay where I compared like Newtonian atomism to market quantification, and it's the same idea.
Could you, if you find it, could you send a link later on after our talk, please?
It's called The Metaphysical Implications of Nominalist Economics, is what the essay is called. But yeah.
Okay. Did you ever notice with philosophers that they interchangeably they equivocate the terms universal and objective when they talk about ethics?
You cut out there. Could you restate that? Hello?
Did you ever notice? Hello?
Yeah. Okay, you're back. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm back. Did you ever notice with when debating other philosophers or other thinkers that they equivocate the terms universal and objective when they talk about ethics? I noticed sometimes that many of them seem to think that universal is the same as objective. What are your views about this? About using these two terms when talking about ethics? Universal values, objective.
So certainly there can be a relative notion of the good, which is not universal, but at the same time, anything that's particular or relative is also universal. So there's kind of a nuance there that I guess is what you're getting at. But most of the time, the problem is more fundamental than what you're getting at. What you're getting at, I think, is a more nuanced problem in philosophy, but most people are not that nuanced, so they just make really kind of simple blunders. But no, actually, I'm not sure. Could you elaborate on what you're talking about?
Yeah, I've listened to some debates amongst philosophers, theists and atheists in the past, and theists would talk about objective moral values, and atheists would talk about universal moral values. I define universal as being something that everybody believes, or everybody that is quote unquote normal believes. But that is not the same as saying that moral values are objective, which basically means that they transcend the material and the created world. This is what I was getting at.
Yeah, I don't think that the atheist can give a really coherent explanation of how that is, because you can't locate anything that they're calling objective in the physical chemical world. I mean, the physical chemical world is reductionism, right? It's reductionist. So how are you going to get any notion of the objective or some principle of what's the truth out of purely physical matter. I mean, it's just kind of nonsensical. So I think that that's just kind of sidestepping the question on the part of the atheist.
You had some interesting debates with Muslims or Muslim scholars or Muslim philosophers, and the most important or the most interesting theme among in your debates was Trinity and Muslim God. It seems as if they believe that Christians are not real monotheists, that the Muslims are real monotheists because they truly believe in one God, and Christians don't. How do you respond to that in such debates?
Right. Well, this is a new area for me, so I'm not a Muslim scholar. I've only been looking into Islam for the past 8 months or so. But one thing that is consistent is that they're used to dealing with Western ideas of Christianity that emphasize the simplicity and unity of the divine essence to the exclusion of multiplicity and the trihypostatic reality that Orthodoxy focuses on. So for us, we don't begin our philosophizing about the unity of God with the essence. We begin with the person of the Father. So it's this called monarchia. The monarchia of the Father, I don't mean modalistic monarchianism, that's a heresy. I mean the monarchia of the Father as the sole cause and arche of the Godhead is unique to the emphasis that we put in Orthodox theology. So there are some Catholics who speak this way, but they're definitely in the minority, especially after the Middle Ages. And so what we have is a better, I would say, approach to answering a lot of the objections that Muslims have, such as why is Jesus, if he's a divine hypostasis, he's the Logos, why is he submitting himself to the Father? Why is the Father? Because the Father is the origin of the Godhead, right? This is downplayed in Latin theology. That's the point. So we have a better answer, I think, as Orthodox to the Islamic apologetic. This is why they trip up so many Roman Catholic and Protestant apologists, is because of the assumptions of divine simplicity in the West. But we have a better approach. And on top of that, the question of multiplicity in relationship to God is not just a problem about 3 persons in the Godhead. This is they have the same problem when we ask about Allah and the distinction between his attributes, the distinction between his giving the Quran and himself, his essence, the distinction between the eternal Quran and Allah. All those same problems are there in Islam, but they just brush that over and they don't answer it. So as you can see, once one of their scholars is pushed and pressed on the issue, they can't answer it. I had a very similar situation with one of his associates, another apologist who's maybe a little bit lesser known than him, where about a month earlier we had the same debate. And it was essentially about their doctrine of tanzih, which is the radical dissimilarity between Allah and creation. If that's the case, then the words of the Quran don't really tell us anything about Allah. So that is an issue, again, that they always sort of avoid. But the other issue that I think really clears up the difference is that between Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, I think the real textual debate is about which religion has continuity. Which religion has the continuity with the Old Testament? And as you could see, Dr. Shabir Ali would frequently quote the Old Testament to prove his position, and then turn around and frequently point out that the Old Testament was all corrupted. Gigantic portions corrupt. So that's a double standard, right? He just uses it when he needs it, tosses it away when it's not helpful to his case. So that's moving the goalposts. And he engaged again in multiple fallacies, tu quoque, shifting the blame, multiple fallacies in the debate, which I called out. So I think if you're aware of that kind of stuff, the Muslim apologetic loses all of its force.
Wikipedia says about your site, Jay's Analysis, the following. His website is Jay's Analysis, which is dedicated to investigating the deeper themes and messages found in our 21st century.
Hold on, no, I don't think I'm on Wikipedia. So
maybe it's not. It's Wikispooks.
Yeah, that's just some guy who does a conspiracy. That's probably a conspiracy guy's site.
Probably.
It is. I know who that.
So your founder of a site called Jay's Analysis, where you research, where you investigate the Hollywood and Hollywood as a tool for promoting narratives, important cultural, societal narratives. What is your method when you investigate that, and what are your conclusions? And the last and not the least important, how do you get the grip over narrative if it's even possible? When I say how do you get the grip over it, I mean us people against the Hollywood or the oligarchs behind it that are creators of it.
Yeah, so the website started as when I was doing my undergraduate and graduate work. I was just blogging about movies, my analysis of film, because my graduate work was on philosophy and propaganda. So I was looking at the way movies, particularly James Bond and that series, were a very important Cold War propaganda outlet. So I was analyzing that at the same time as taking film classes, studying Oliver Stone films, studying the history behind those films. And that just blossomed into a website. I blogged a lot. And then eventually I got some interviews and a publisher reached out, and then that led to a TV show that we did on the basis of the first book, a full season of a full production show. So I just kind of kept talking about the stuff that I was interested in. So I would talk about geopolitics. I'd talk about movies. I'd talk about propaganda, how movies are propaganda, music as well, other avenues of pop culture. And then what I did was I branched out into probably the most important aspect of the work I've done is what I call my Global Elite book series, where I've done about 45 of the top elites books of the last 100 years. So we did, for example, Propaganda by Edward Bernays. We did Bertrand Russell's books, H.G. Wells' books, a lot of CIA memoirs, operatives, high-level people's, Carol Quigley's Tragedy and Hope. They're big geopolitical tomes, social engineering tomes, stuff to do with mind control in the CIA, from the establishment themselves, not conspiracy books, but people like Dr. John C. Lilly involved in those programs, all of which was about controlling the mass mind, right? So that's a big part of what I tried to focus on in the last 3 or 4 years. So those lectures, I think, are very crucial for understanding the modern world. But how do we control or get the narrative back? Well, one thing, we got to stop giving our money to those companies. So we should be very aware of where our money goes, where we're funding and giving our time and energy and attention to these companies that don't have our best interest. So that's one way to take back the narrative. Try to expose it like I'm doing, which, I mean, I haven't taken down Hollywood or anything like that, but I have been able to reach a lot of people in the last several years doing this kind of analysis and covering this kind of material. So hopefully it has helped people, kind of break free from that matrix, so to speak. But the main problem now is maybe not so much Hollywood, but the way the tech companies are kind of taking over. And they're going to control the narrative. So the main problem now is the tech companies, and I don't really have an answer to how we take the narrative back from them.
You mean like Facebook, Twitter? Yeah.
I mean, I think they're controlling the narratives more than Hollywood is now. I think Hollywood's declining. Hollywood is kind of bequeathing itself over to Netflix and Hulu and Amazon streaming services. That's the new Hollywood.
Although Hollywood is in a downfall, has there been any backlash against your work from the Hollywood creators or the oligarchs behind it?
No, not really. Mainly, the only problems I've had were on the tech censorship side. I had my website deleted completely 2 years ago. And then I just had my YouTube channel demonetized. So that's really been the main problem I've had, not anything movie related.
how does it happen? Through algorithms, or do you think that there are people that follow your channel or follow your sites and then go to the Twitter and to Facebook and tell them?
I would say most likely algorithmic, just because there's so many different channels. I mean, it's not like I have some vast network of power. I mean, I'm a mediocre sized channel. So it seems to be this stuff comes in waves where they'll go through and they'll just purge like anyone talking about XYZ, right? And so it just deletes everybody in a few days that talks about that. Or the other day when they demonetized my channel, they demonetized a whole bunch of channels that were dealing with like Christian content. So who knows? But I think it's probably algorithmic.
This is my very personal question. I remember when I watched this movie, Hollywood movie, Transcendence with Johnny Depp, and I saw today when I Googled a little bit about you once again, that you made an esoteric analysis of the movie, and the title was something I thought of it when I watched it. The kind of film stupid people think is smart.
Yeah, I was thinking about Lucy by Luc Besson and Transcendence. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like pop science. Like people think that, when NASA talks about a black hole or I mean, this stuff comes out, oh, NASA's found a planet where everything's diamonds or who knows? It's all, I think a lot of that's just conjecture. And so the same thing goes on in what I call scientism, right? I mean, it's more like scientism. People really buy into this narrative, again, through science fiction, that they're going to be downloaded into the cloud, uploaded to the cloud, and all this nonsense. It's just ridiculous, but that's the power of propaganda. And one of the things I tried to cover in my book was the power of science fiction propaganda. I mean, I think science fiction propaganda is overlooked as to how powerful it's been in the last century. That's why I went back to people like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, and because they were really prepping us for, I mean, they were Hollywood before Hollywood. They were able to sell us these narratives of, oh, we're going to have space colonies and it's going to be this utopia. We're going to be flying around in cars and, and none of that. It's actually a dystopia, right? That we're entering into. And so they sell people on the dystopia through the utopia, through science fiction.
Do you have an opinion about people like, for example, I don't know, Neil deGrasse Tyson or Richard Dawkins, or these are exemplary people that promote science as some sort of esoteric tool for achieving transcendence. They talk about being in awe of the universe and so forth. Do you have an opinion about this?
Yeah, I think those guys are more or less kind of puppets. They're more or less like pop figure people that are propped up by the establishment to sell the gospel of scientism. Absolutely.
Could their behavior and their thoughts and their how they articulate them be explained by their psychology or their lack of philosophical and theological knowledge?
Probably both. I think that they're probably hip enough to know what the establishment wants promoted out there in the mainstream. So they're hip enough to that, to know what words to say, where they can go, where they can't go. Neil deGrasse Tyson himself has said he hates philosophy. It's a waste of time. So there's ignorance as well. All of those things. But I think just a more basic level, it's easier to control these kinds of people with money and popularity.
The last question, I haven't noticed if you ever dealt with this question, but amongst in America, it was quite interesting, these debates between young earth creationists, Protestant young earth creationists, and evolutionists, or the proponents of theory of evolution. Have you ever put any harder thoughts on theory of evolution and
Yes, I have a lot of critiques.
evolutionism?
Yeah, I have a lot of critiques that I've done of evolution, Darwinism. Wolfgang Smith has some really good books that critique it, like Cosmos and Transcendence. Dr. Jason Lisle, Sarfati, all those guys have good critiques of evolutionary theory. But Father Stephan Rose, of course, has one of the best, a big fat book, Genesis, Creation, Early Man. So we're big proponents of that book at my website. I promote it a lot. I think there's serious philosophical problems in Darwinian evolutionary theory. And again, a lot of that is just based on science fiction, ironically. But yeah, I have probably, I don't know, 10 talks where I kind of dive into critiquing that on my YouTube channel or website. So very much a critic of that view. I tend to favor young Earth creationism, although I don't set like a specific date. I don't know the exact date of the Earth. But I do tend to, I think it's important to defend the historicity of the Book of Genesis.
The last question. What do you think about the States, about the USA? Who has the greatest power over mobilization of the looters? Do you have an opinion about it?
Yeah, I think that if you look at the history of the color revolutions, you'll notice that a lot of money through private foundations was poured into those groups by National Endowment for Democracy, Soros's foundation. So that model of color revolution sparking the revolution is the exact same as the color revolutions that Soros funded, and Soros put money into Black Lives Matter. So I think that it's very clear.
What will be the result of it? Is this going to have bad consequences for United States and for the world, or?
Well, you have a faction of the elite that wants to go ahead and move into what they call the Great Reset. They want more power for the United Nations and a global government in that way. And then you have another faction of the elite that Trump represents that are more Americanist. They represent American interests that would not like to move. I mean, they're both globalists in a general sense, but a lot of American interests don't immediately want to move into this full-on global technocracy, whereas the UN associated groups, they do. They're more radical. They want to move us already into this technocratic dystopia. So that's the reason for some of the battle that's going on in the U.S. upper elite echelons right now, the deep state, all that stuff. It's two different factions of the power structure trying to figure out which game plan they want to implement for the next several years. Now, the hardcore globalists, they absolutely are ready to move into austerity, what they call the Great Reset. I shared multiple articles from the World Economic Forum in the last week about that. And they want to utilize the situations that we've just seen with the difficulties of the quote COVID, and then now they've sparked this. These are related to, on the one hand, Trump, but at a greater level, moving us into and I don't really care about American politics, but I'm just giving my analysis of what I think is going on, moving us into the next phase of the technocracy.
Jay Dyer, it's been a fanboy delight. Thank you for your time, for your
Thank you. I'm honored.
Substance. I hope I can ask you for another interview some other time. We'll put some links beneath the video when I upload it about your work. And for other people, maybe for your viewers, if you like my content, maybe they can subscribe to my YouTube channel too. Jay, thank you.
Yes, and I would say if people do want to support me, they can subscribe at my website. You can subscribe the subscription link there, or you can get the books at the website as well, and I'll have links to you as well.
Okay, cool.
Honored. Thank you very much.
Jay.
It was a pleasure.
Honored too.
Have a good day.
Bye. You too.